you would think that the IMF and World Bank would be institutions that were bettering the human race. It was improving the human race. And I think that's really how they advertise themselves. But the reality is quite different, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that most Bitcoiners are aware that these institutions are up to no good. Especially the IMF, I think, has had a negative reputation among, let's say, leftists and libertarians. I think, for a long time. And look, you speak to people in the global South, and they immediately are, very skeptical of the IMF. But the World Bank has a much better reputation generally. And either way, I think most folks kind of in the mainstream would say something like, well, maybe they make mistakes, but, we really need them. We need a global lender of last resort, with the IMF, and we need a institution that's going to invest in infrastructure projects in poor countries where there, is not appetite from private capital in the case of the World Bank. So I think people just sort of justify them, even if they know there's some problems. But when you really dive in and look at what they've been doing in a meta sense, since the 60s, what the results have been, and kind of who they've allied with and what their incentives are, as I argue, it basically reveals that they've become a colonial force, that's emerged since decolonization in the 60s. They've helped kind of replenish some of those colonial flows that used to come into rich countries from poor countries through traditional imperialism. They've helped replenish those and help build that flow, so that since 1982, poor countries are subsidizing the quality of life of people in rich countries to the tune of these days, several $1 trillion a year. And I think that's what's, really shocking. The second thing is just the structural adjustment generally. Like, it's not just the loans. It's not just the fact that these are not gifts. These are usually high interest rate loans where the borrowing country, will end up paying maybe $1.5 billion back on $1 billion loan, or maybe even $2 billion over the lifetime of the loan. It's not just that the flow is like coming the other way, and that these institutions and their creditors are making money off these loans and off, development. It's that the global South countries are being like engineered to be more kind of like dependent on us and less sovereign. And that's the really crazy part, is that, again, not only is it sort of a debt trap, but these countries are sort of forced to become dependent on buying, let's say like mainly like agricultural products, food from the West, and then producing stuff that we need. So this sort of, these are two things that are related in the spiral and the drain, I guess, that I've described.
So, and why do you think, and you mentioned it earlier, right? You said what they've been doing since the 60s. And I know we don't have enough time to get into the nuance and get into the nooks and crannies of that, but I want to focus on, Alex, what they advertise they've been doing and what they've actually been doing.
Well, when they were set up in 1944, they're Bretton Woods institutions. So they were set up originally in a hotel in New Hampshire in 1944 by the Allies, by the winning side of World War II. They were originally set up to avoid what happened in the 1930s with global trade, where it kind of broke down and there was a lot of countries kind of pulling back away from trade to be self-sovereign. That wasn't good for people who make money on global trade, meaning countries like the US. So the Bretton Woods institutions were set up to prevent that from happening, meaning to keep the trade flowing. So, a lot of people think that that's a good thing, and that we should all just be comparative advantage, free market, making the stuff we're good at and then trading with each other. I have questions about that, let's say, after doing this research about whether or not that's ideal. But put that to the side. The mainstream would say that's a good thing. Yeah, let's not have like trade breakdown. So for example, the idea being post 44, if some country had like a crisis where its imports started to really outweigh its exports, that the IMF could step in and provide a 2 to 3 year loan to tide it over until it could get back on its feet. Ditto the World Bank, if some country like couldn't afford a really important hydroelectric dam, let's say, the World Bank would come in and lead a round with a bunch of other investors, and the local government could get that built. So that's what they're advertised for, and that's what essentially they do. It's just you have to think about the second order effects of that. And in the IMF's case, it means bailing out dictators for decades with a bigger and bigger debt pile that the citizens are always left holding the bag with. And the dictators really never personally have to pay it off, even though they skim, 20-30% off the top. On the World Bank side, what it means is these enormous projects that the World Bank and its creditors and its allies benefit from through the dynamic of what's called the double loan. So, for example, the World Bank will help a big loan be given out to a country like Ghana or Argentina or Brazil, etc. And let's say it's $1 billion in today's money. So what happens is within the first year or two, that entire $1 billion gets spent by, let's say, Brazil on the Western companies who are going to build everything. So let's say it's a dam in Brazil. So the World Bank leads around. It's $1 billion in credit. Credit gets extended to the Brazilian government. Brazilian government pays $1 billion to have the thing built, and it pays Western companies. So the West has been paid back within a year or two right away. But Brazil now, the taxpayers of Brazil now owe principal plus interest on the billion. So when all is said and done, the West gets, let's say, $2.5 billion. They make a lot of money on this thing. And what ends up happening is that dam usually benefits them. Like, it's usually a dam that is basically powering, let's say, a mineral harvesting operation where 90% of the profits are going towards the West with really cheap, really below market cheap energy because of the dam. So this is not development in the true sense. It's not like the local population is being embittered or benefiting in any real way. Other people are somewhere else, and they're paying for it. And that's why what the World Bank does, is so sort of devious. Is it's sort of hidden away, but they really do accomplish the same feats as a lot of colonial dynamics. Just by using debt as a weapon instead of a gun or a ship with cannons, etc.
So, Alex, why do they prefer dictators? Why is that?
Well, I mean, and we can debate about democracy and what does it mean and what's a democracy, but generally speaking, it's much easier for them to deal with a dictatorial client that can just put down protests with, or quell them at any time, because the structural adjustment policies that the IMF attaches to loans are not popular. They're called austerity measures. Nobody wants them. Everybody knows what's coming. The masses know what's coming. The masses know what's coming is currency devaluation, basically a recession, shrinking bank credit, more, rising taxes, rising interest rates, an end or dramatically reduced subsidies for things like bread and fuel. That's what the IMF wants, and that's why people get pissed. So if it's a dictatorship, like Marcos in the Philippines, it was easy. He didn't have to deal with a Supreme Court ruling him down, by the end of his term, or a legislature, like a Senate or a Congress, a House getting angry with him. He didn't have to deal with labor unions or whatever. He could just do whatever he wants, and he would shoot anybody or prison anybody who disagrees with him. You try to do austerity on a democracy, people are going to be marching in the streets. The Supreme Court's going to be, kind of vetoing maybe contracts with foreign companies. You're going to have people in the Congress or the Senate trying to overturn stuff. You're going to have labor unions pushing back. So, there's no perfect society, but these democratic societies are much more hard to deal with when you're trying to impose something on them, because the people can fight back. So that's why traditionally the IMF really preferred dictators who could just they could just be like easy clients to work with.
They can control them easier,
Oh yeah,
basically. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, a dictatorship is way easier to control than a democracy. Is the point? Where a liberal democracy, properly understood, yeah, that's much harder because power is decentralized among different parties. You don't just have the military. You have the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch. You have the media. You have labor unions. You have lobby groups. You have like this, all kinds of different people kind of jostling for power. And they're not going to like someone coming in and like crushing their economy so that people can get cheaper stuff in other countries, can buy their stuff for cheaper. Dictators don't care because they can take a percentage off the top of the new money flowing in and like everybody else be damned.